Hello and welcome to this webinar on navigating PCI compliance. I'm Jack Poller, Senior Analyst with Enterprise Strategy Group. Joining me today is Mike Toole from Blumira. Mike, can you introduce yourself to the audience, please?
Hey there, Mike Toole here. I run security and IT for Blumira.
Thanks. Nice to meet you, Mike. And also joining me today is Jamie Tomasello from Keel Paradox. Jamie, can you let us know a little bit about you?
Absolutely. Hi, everyone. I am the founder of Keel Paradox, which is a cybersecurity consulting company that specifically focuses on working with early stage startups and nonprofits to establish their security programs and help them on their security and compliance journey.
Excellent. Well, it's great to meet you both. And today we're here to talk about PCI, which is really the payment card industry data security standards, or PCI DSS. And that's a big mouthful for a data security standard. Jamie, maybe you could tell us a little bit about what's involved in this.
Sure. So as you mentioned, this came out of the Payment Card Industry Security Standards Council. And this framework and assessment applies to merchants or service providers who process, transmit, or store cardholder data or sensitive authentication data, like your CVV and other pieces from your credit card transaction. Or if you are a service provider, if you provide a security control that could materially impact another organization's PCI compliance with their use of your product, then you're also considered a service provider under PCI, and you would need to pursue PCI compliance.
Excellent. So you've talked a little bit about sort of who needs to comply. But you mentioned service providers and payment merchants. But as a small business person, how do I know if I need to comply? If I'm doing retail or I have a website that's what is it that's really triggering me to think about PCI DSS?
Yeah. So, thanks for asking that question. Ultimately, if you are accepting credit cards, you're processing credit cards in some way as a merchant, even if you're a small business, this does apply to you because, this can impact your ability to maintain a merchant account and ultimately accept credit cards. A lot of times merchants go, well, I'm using, I'm outsourcing this. I'm using a third-party provider. I'm not storing any information. And that's true, and that's great. So a lot of times merchants who are card not present merchants that have fully outsourced all their cardholder data functions to a PCI DSS compliant third-party provider with no electronic storage, and the processing or the transmission of any cardholder data is not on the merchant systems, they still need to complete what's called an SAQA, which is a self-assessment questionnaire A, that's only 22 sub-requirements that just generally focuses on, do we generally have information security practices in place and some of the controls. However, there are some small businesses and some merchants who they may be outsourcing all of their payment processing, and they have websites that don't directly receive the cardholder data, but they can impact the security of the payment transaction. So this is the one thing for small businesses, early stage startups, nonprofits to think about is their actual implementation on their website. So essentially, it's a direct post versus a redirect or iframe implementation. And if you aren't if you don't have the right implementation, you're going from an SAQA that you're doing yourself of 22 sub-requirements to an SAQA EP that is 191 sub-requirements. So it's something that's really important as you're assessing, as you're thinking about how you're accepting credit card data and how that's implemented on your website, that you're working with an assessor or a security consultant to really make sure that the implementation that you're putting in reduces the risk both to yourself and to your customers.
Well, so we've got this security standard, right? This thing that says whenever you're dealing with credit cards or payment cards, you have to do a whole bunch of stuff. What exactly is this stuff doing to help our security? Maybe Mike, you could sort of start.
Yeah, so I kind of like to think of the PCI controls as it's like a hardening guide, right? So it's a great place. You go through their controls, right? It's pretty exhaustive as far as all the security controls that they have in there, and it's broken out into subsections and categories. And effectively, you're hardening your environment against threats and attackers, and you're adding security controls that are prescribed by PCI that meet the needs of most vendors that do card transactions or hold card data, depending on what bucket you're in.
Right. So some of the concerns, and a lot of the data that I have in research that I've done over the years looks at sort of how attackers are attacking people and organizations. And they try to get into your website and say, oh, you have a database of your customers and it has your customer name, your customer address, email, and it has their credit card information. And if I can get access to that, then I essentially have the ability to go and steal their credit card information and get lots of buy lots of goods using somebody else's credit card, which is maybe a bad thing, right? So we're trying to protect against those types of attacks. I know one of the things that the requirement says is that we have to encrypt the credit card information. So if a bad guy gets access to that database, they can't read the credit card information. What are some of the other controls that are in place?
Yeah, so like most other frameworks, it's layer based, right? So like you mentioned, encryption is huge. Making sure data is encrypted and protect against when an attacker does get in, right? They may be able to poke around, but they might not be able to get the data out or usefully, right? Like there's lots of controls around firewalls, segmenting, access controls, who can access them, understanding what's going on in your environment, right? With logs, collecting like when people access things, how they access it, right? And it's just a lot of it is understanding at multiple layers what your environment looks like, and adding multiple steps in there so that an attacker just can't get access, and then it's a free-for-all, right?
Also, I think one of the things to keep in mind as well, Jack, for PCI compliance in particular, is that it's highly scoped, right? So it's really going to be scoped around your cardholder data environment, how these
Yep.
controls are applied. Oftentimes folks will look at this particular prescriptive framework and go, oh my gosh, I can't do all of this right now because of our size. But I think also when we're talking about this with our small businesses that are merchants, they don't have the credit card in a database, right? They are working with a third party who has that credit card database. And so they don't have as many of those requirements that they need to be complying with. So it really is important that they recognize what the scope is. You don't, if you just go in and go, oh, I accept credit cards, or I produce this service that may touch or help facilitate the processing, storage, or transmission of credit card information, all of these requirements may not be applicable to you. So that's something to just keep in mind.
Right.
And Mike, in your experience, I know in your past that you've implemented PCI compliance and worked with PCI QSAs or qualified security assessors, both from a merchant perspective as well as a service provider perspective. With those limited budgets and staff, what should IT teams focus on first when they're reviewing these controls and processes requirements?
Yeah, one of the big things that I've found super useful, and it's actually pretty low cost, is to just take the first step of understand your environment, right? So because PCI is so scoped to your credit card, environment, right? Like wherever you're doing transactions or making, using your service or whatever, right? Like it, being able to understand that environment both technically and like at a logical state helps you when you start going down the path to implementing these controls, because then you can really understand like, okay, what bucket am I in, right? there's a lot of traps. Let's say you outsource your web development and somebody implements the payment logic for you, right? Like, and they tell you that it's all offline, but maybe there's a session somewhere. Like, being able to understand that and really poke around your environment to understand like the full scope of it so that you can control it is like a huge first step.
And Mike,
It,
go ahead, Jack.
I was just going to say, in looking at this, I look at what we have displayed here on these requirements, and they are requirements from this particular standard, but a lot of these are actually just good security practices in general. And even if you're not, dealing with PCI DSS directly, if you look at number 2, do not use, defaults for passwords and other security parameters. That's sort of security 101. We want to do that. For every system you ever get, you always want to change default passwords, right? So I think,
Yep.
it may seem overwhelming as a standard, but a lot of this is sort of basic common sense.
Yeah, and you can also take the approach of the crawl, walk, run, right? So you start crawling, right? Like, you go through the controls that you may already have, right? Like, you're probably going to have a lot of these controls already. You just need to verify that they're there, right? So start with that, and then you work on, slowly over time, just getting up to a place where you can run, right?
I would second that. One of the things also to think about is from that crawl, walk, run perspective, like, don't let perfection be the enemy of good. And it's better for you to consistently apply a control, and you have a good sense of what your risk is to your business, than it is to say like, oh, we have a 10 over here, but a 1 over here, or it's inconsistently applied. And so maybe we have change management, but maybe we don't, or maybe we are doing vulnerability scanning some quarters, but not in others. And that really opens your organization up to risk, because you don't have a good sense of where you are all the time in case of a security incident. Versus just saying, you know what, we're going to start here, we're going to implement this. And let's say maybe we're a 4 across the board, but you're a 4 across the board. You know what the likelihood and the impact is of the risk to your organization. And then you slowly mature, which is the whole concept of a security maturity model.
Yep. Yeah, exactly.
I like the crawl, walk, run, and don't let perfection be the enemy of anything. But let's maybe move from sort of those standard platitudes to sort of your real world experience. You've both been in the field doing this. Maybe you can tell us what it's really like to deal with PCI in the real
world. Yeah, so obviously it's very different, right? Like Jamie talked about with having to do a SAQ versus like a full environment, and depending on how you store card data, or even like what level, that gets into a whole other thing, right? Like if you're a service provider, it really comes down to understanding these controls. And one of the biggest traps you can also fall into is thinking that you're compliant against one of these controls, right? Like so there's plenty of them that honestly are a little hard to read, right? So you think you're compliant, and then you get down the road, and then you're working with a QSA, and they have questions. It can be difficult to be in that position of well, hey, are you actually doing this? Like, can you show me, right? Like, how do you know you're doing this? And that's where like really diving deep in to some of these controls, and doing the like crawl, walk, run, right? Like really understanding what you're doing as you go can be super beneficial, because somewhere down the road somebody's going to ask you the question why, and you're going to have to be able to answer that.
Yeah, I think the other thing to keep in mind too is that when you are building a security program and you're implementing these controls, it's not just a technical checklist. It really is people, process, and technology, and we need to be implementing these things with empathy, simplicity, and integrity, because at the end of the day, probably the most challenging area is actually winning over hearts and minds, right? The people in your organization, perhaps, especially when you're early stage, a lot of people are just trying to get the product out the door, or they care about the work that they do, and they can view compliance as like like I like to say, capital C compliance, the word people swear with. They don't like it, and it inhibits their work, and they view it as a negative experience. It's just red tape, and it serves no purpose. So it's really important as you're implementing security controls to find opportunities where it's operational improvements. Understand the pain points of your various teams. And for example, if you're implementing a secure software a development life cycle, being able to identify, well, here's the current pain points you have. And hey, if we implement this kind of testing, then we don't have to go back and bug fix it later when we have less time or there's more pressures, and really change some of the framing to say, like, these are operational improvements, or these are the things that our clients expect of us. And we want to earn their trust. And this is one of the ways that we do it versus saying, we have to implement PCI compliant controls because I said so. Nobody likes hearing because I said so.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and
that can
then
cause a
oh,
lot of pain and a lot of conflict in an organization.
yeah, I was just gonna add to, like, to go back to what you said earlier about how a lot of these are just like basic security controls, right? You're gonna get the additive effect of this stuff is great for your non-PCI environment, right? Like, so all of your uh Active Directory hardening or Google workspace hardening, right? Like that is an org-wide control that you're adding on, that's going to have like intended security to build out that security program for your whole company, not just your PCI environment, right? Everyone's going to need a firewall, right? Like you're having good firewalls, clean rules, understanding how it works is just super beneficial, especially as you grow.
And maybe your environment has it doesn't have that prescriptive setup, right? But that's okay because PCI also has space for compensating or mitigating controls. So at
Yep.
the end of the day, as long as you understand the what and the why around the spirit of the control, then you're really working with your engineering or your IT or other teams. And maybe you don't have all those teams, but you have a little bit more flexibility on the how, as long as you have a good grasp on the what and the why, and that that you've selected a good assessor who is in alignment with your tech stack.
Yeah, that
I'm
is
glad
really
you brought
important.
up this. I'm sorry, Mike. Go ahead.
Oh, I've been in that space before. It's like super important to have like an assessor that really does understand your environment and like who you are as a company.
Yeah, so I was going to dive into that a little bit because at the beginning of the conversation, you mentioned that if you have a very limited exposure, essentially, to the payment information, then you do a self-assessment. But if it goes beyond that and you have a little bit more complex environment, or you have a lot more data that you're keeping track of, what is involved with working with assessors, and how do you find good assessors?
Sure. So one of the things you have to think about is, do I need to do a self-assessment questionnaire, or am I required to have a third-party independent assessor come in? Once you've assessed that, you may also have a situation where, although you could do a self-assessment, you may have requirements from your own clients who want to see a third-party assessment done. Now, that could be PCI DSS, that could be a SOC 2, type 1, type 2. For most people, if you haven't done those before, you're not going to be jumping to the ISO 27000 series, but it could also be that. So there's some situations where it's advantageous, although you're not required, based on, again, your mileage may vary based on what you've already figured out, what your requirements are, to work with a third party assessor. But sometimes there may be a reason that helps the business to go ahead and do that and have that report. When you are looking for a qualified security assessor and you're looking for an organization, you want to make sure that you're interviewing these assessors. You not just the organization or the firm themselves, but really using it almost like a job interview of who they would be bringing onto your account. You want to have a good understanding what their philosophy is around how they interpret the PCI standard itself and the requirements within it. You want to understand what their positions are on compensating or mitigating controls. And you want to get a good sense of what their tech experience is. Is all their experience being in a cloud environment, AWS, GCP, and does that work for you all? Or are they used to Microsoft products and Azure? So it's really important to make sure that they are knowledgeable about the technology and the implementation so that they're trying to assess you as objectively as possible without getting too dogmatic around technical implementation.
Right. Makes a lot of sense because you want to treat, I would think you would want to treat your assessors as partners, not just as vendors, right? To work with you because you're all working together to improve the overall security of your organization.
Absolutely. It should be a collaborative process. I've spoken with people who view their assessors as a combative situation, or that whether it's an assessor or an auditor, depending on the framework that they're working with, they view them as like they're coming in to test me, they're coming in to trick me, they're to trap me. And that's most assessors, that's not why they're there. Ultimately, they want to see you meet these controls and have a positive assessment and then give you recommendations on how you can make things better or how you can evolve them for the future. They want to continue to be your assessor. So for them, it is much better for it to be a collaborative relationship versus a combative one. And also, don't keep secrets from your assessor. It's a lot easier to, get those skeletons out of the closet now and say like, hey, this is what we're dealing with, and they can help you working with advisors. You don't want to have a conflict of interest, of course, to be able to get you where you need to be able to achieve your PCI assessment and your compliance, and really look at the appropriate, sustainable control implementation.
Right. I think ultimately, when I think about these standards, that the goal here is not to have a standard just to have a standard, not to be compliant just to be compliant. It really is about protecting the payment data and eliminating the possibility for big breaches. I think, if you've been around for a while, you might have heard of the Target breach, where Target's payment systems were breached and they lost hundreds of millions of dollars on both fraud and just other negative effects from the entire cybersecurity incident, right? So we're really trying to avoid those situations, and there's nothing worse than waking up in the morning and having your company and your name in the headlines for doing something wrong, right? And losing data. So, when we think about sort of PCI, I know that there's been a new version coming out. Let's sort of dive into the latest revision, which is, I believe, the 4.0 revision, and what sort of changes are happening.
Yeah, so the slide that you saw previously as we were talking through it was the PCI DSS requirements under 3.2.1. And it's the PCI we're used to seeing for the past several years. But as we go to 4.0, these requirements have evolved, they've received clarification or guidance, or they had a change in their structure and format. So when we compare the goals between PCI DSS 3.2.1 and 4.0, just on their face, we don't see a lot of changes, except the changing in the language from protecting cardholder data to protecting account data. But where we see a much more significant change is when we are looking at the PCI DSS requirements more individually. And as we look at that, and we go to the next slide, we can see that they are more obvious at that sub-requirement and requirement level. and you see like a huge difference in the language. So Jack, you had pointed out like, oh, it seems like a no-brainer, like to do not use vendor supplied defaults for system passwords or other security parameters. Well, in 4.0, that statement has been revised to apply secure configurations to all system components. So it really makes it a lot more clear. We also see a change in the language around just about stored cardholder data to, hey, well, you need to protect the stored account data. And you see things where it's like calling out specifically malware or antivirus solutions, and it changes to protect all systems and networks from malicious software. So it's sort of, it changed a little bit how things are worded or phrased. So that, that's something to look at. It's a little bit different, besides the fact that they changed capitalization. That's all right. That's not a big deal. But one of the things, and going back to Mike's point around PCI being prescriptive and some and being helpful and articulating what those controls should be, but also being confused at sometimes at the language or the wording, my favorite improvement on 4.0 is the inclusion of defined approach requirements, a customized approach objective, defined approach testing procedures, and then each set of PCI guidance has a purpose, good practice, and definitions. So this helps clarify the requirements, and hopefully it reduces the subjectivity and conflict between assessors. So let's say you're using an advisor, and then you have an assessor who's going to actually do the assessment, or maybe you're transitioning from one assessor to another assessor. This new guidance is going to help reduce any conflicts or surprises as you're going through that process. So I highly recommend going to the PCI Security Standard Council website and downloading the PDF for the full text of the security standard. I think I'm looking at my copy here. It's this one. It's huge. I print it out. Not everybody needs to waste the trees, but I like to have all of my compliance documents at hand. It's 356 pages, but it is heavily detailed, and there's all the information that you need to know is available to you, but you can also work with an assessor or a security consultant to help you understand what those things are. In particular, if we go forward, one of the big changes in PCI is around some of the requirements for requirement 10, which is logging and monitoring, something that's really important. And the big thing that you see changed here is the reflection, the change in the focus towards all audit logs, system components, and cardholder data. And it also that it doesn't they clarified that it doesn't apply to the user activities of the consumers or the cardholders. But there's a whole lot of detail here now around logging and monitoring. And honestly, it doesn't matter what framework you're looking at. When it comes to logging and monitoring, at the end of the day, we want to make sure that we are logging and recording the necessary information. We want to be monitoring logs and generating alerts and events. And when we say monitor logs, that doesn't mean like not reviewing them. It means and reviewing them. Proactively detecting threats or anomalous or suspicious activity, and responding to these events. And you have to do all of this with haste to contain the threat and mitigate harm. I know that could be really challenging for some organizations to think about, but at the end of the day, this is such a core component to understand what you're protecting, what you're detecting, and being able to action it to reduce harm to your organization. Because at the end of the day, you will not protect everything all the time, but you can mitigate the harm all the time. So all of these changes for 4.0, when are they coming into play? As we are seeing 3.1 transition to 4.0. So the timeline for 4.0, and next slide, please. So the implementation timeline for PCI DSS 3.2.1 is essentially it is retiring on March 31st, 2024, and all future dated new requirements are coming into play in 2025. So folks who have already scheduled their assessments, they can still go through 3.2.1 up until March 31st. But everybody else, if you don't have your assessment scheduled before that date, you will be on 4.0 going forward.
So I have a question on that, and both an observation and a question. But you mentioned earlier that particularly logging and monitoring with haste, and I just sort of comment on that with haste, everybody's timelines are different, in understanding of times are different. But from the cybersecurity industry, we look at what we call the dwell time, which is how long it takes for an organization to detect that they have been attacked in some way or another, and that the attackers are inside and have access to their data. And unfortunately, these days, that time is not measured in minutes or hours or even days, but it's typically weeks and months. And in some cases, attackers have been known to have access to systems for a year or more before they are detected. And so, it's important that you understand that and say, if somebody's in my system and has access to it for a year, how many payment cards do I process and how much data did they have access to over that year time? That's why, the sort of the haste is important. But my question sort of on timing is, there's this implementation timeline for 4.0, but how often do we have to sort of run through the compliance checks and the assessments for PCI DSS in general?
Right. So PCI DSS, if you're pursuing this attestation of compliance, this is an annual process, right? So if you're having a third party assess you, you're doing this assessment annually. If you're doing your SAQ, self-assessment questionnaire, you are completing that annually. However, that does not mean that you are maintaining your controls annually. You should be focused on continuous compliance, making sure that you're implementing controls or technologies that help you have as real time as possible a check on your current status, and that you know what's going on in your environment, because we don't want to be looking at this from a point in time perspective. We want to ensure that our controls are operating effectively throughout the year.
All right, so we've talked a lot about sort of PCI in general and how it works and what you have to do. So how can you guys help small businesses and medium-sized businesses with this challenge?
Yeah, I can talk to that a bit. So one of the big things, right, like we saw in section 10 there, around logging and alerting and responding with haste, like that's logging all your systems, but it's also logging all your controls, right? Like, so there's a lot of systems that you're going to be implementing, all the different controls, right? all your stuff has to go somewhere, and you have to know that they're working, right? That's a big piece of this in section 10. So one of the big reasons we built Blumira is there's this gap in a lot of the controls for logging and alerting, where you find yourself having to choose what's important to send logs for, right? Because it can get expensive, storing things is expensive. PCI recommends you store things for a year, but also, like, you have to be able to actively look through those logs. I think it's up to 3 months. So, but really it should be longer than that, right? If we talk about the dwell times that attackers are in environments, right? So the big thing that we offer is just like, send us everything, right? Like that's what we do. Like, send us all your logs, right? We we have custom built detections on top of it, right? You don't have to worry about a lot of that stuff. We do all the logging and automation and alerting on top of it, right? And then you can focus on whatever your business does, right? Like, your job isn't to build this stuff most of the time. It's to run your business, and that's what we want. you to do is be able to just focus on the security of your business, not necessarily like, what the latest and greatest tech is that you have to implement to make this thing work great, right?
Yeah, so maybe we could dive into that a little bit more and sort of what's a typical day in the life of somebody using the tool.
Yeah. So we try to make it as seamless as possible, right? We do 24/7 monitoring, right? You're sending us your logs. It just all happens, right? Once you set this up, we collect your logs, we classify them, we do a bunch of detections. Like it just kind of happens, right? Like we detect attacks, we have a notification, and then we're also here like if you do have an incident, we're here to help as well, right? We have a team of folks that are just amazing, honestly, helping you to respond and giving you playbooks and here, hey, like this happened, right? Okay, here, go do this, this, and this, because that's what you need to do to respond to this exact incident. One of the most I think one of the most useful detections we have, which is honestly like really hard to do if you don't have a system like this in place, is what if an attacker clears your logs, right? So that's something we see very commonly. An attacker gets into a network, right? The first thing they do is clear the logs because they want to be untraceable, right? So that's a very high indicator for us. Something's going on and we need to look into it further. So it's very hard, right? Like if you're just storing your logs in a server somewhere, maybe you review them periodically, right? Like it's very difficult to see that.
Mhm. So I'm assuming you have a bunch of happy customers that have gone through this process, particularly looking at sort of using Blumira for the PCI DSS part of logging and monitoring, right?
Yep, and we actually have a bunch of a lot of our detections can directly map to most of the controls in PCI as well.
Excellent. Anything you think you want to add, Jamie?
I would say, one of the things to keep in mind, and this is why that detection specifically around the like obliteration of logs is really important, is if you are an IT professional who doesn't have the time or the experience of certain security practices as it relates to logging, monitoring, and auditing, it's really going to be difficult to find the anomalous or the suspicious activity. People can say like, oh, here's this indicator of compromise, or here's this bad activity. But unless you're really in it all the time, like Blumira is, you're not going to be able to notice when that subtle change occurs or when it's an anomalous behavior because you're not observing it 24/7. And so that's where having a platform like Blumira is extremely helpful to be able to detect that anomalous or suspicious activity sooner, because as you've mentioned, attackers can gain a foothold very early, and then we're not seeing the symptom until far later after they've had that foothold in your environment. Now, whether that be ransomware, whether that be an exfiltration of data, but they've already been there and done things and pivoted throughout your organization for quite some time.
Yep.
I,
Yeah, and especially if you're one of the big things too is like having the logs be in a useful place, right, is very important because let's say that you do have an incident, when you're doing your incident response, you need to walk back through and see exactly what happened, right? That is very hard to do if you have a system that is just unclassified logs somewhere. It's just a pile of data. Basically, you're effectively like having to go through and comb through everything just to see exactly what happens. It's very costly and time intensive to do that after the fact.
yeah, well, I can't stress enough how hard it is to be a cybersecurity expert, a compliance expert, and be a small business person or small business organization and run your business at the same time. So I'd like to thank Mike and Jamie for joining me to talk about these issues. Obviously you can find Blumira pretty easily for support. Jamie, how can people sort of get a hold of you if they're interested in getting your support?
Absolutely. So if folks are interested in cybersecurity consulting or just having a conversation about the challenges you're facing as a small startup or a small nonprofit, Keel Paradox is the name of my firm. You can go to keelparadox.com, KEEL, or you can email info@keelparadox.com.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Jamie, and thank you, Mike. It's been a pleasure talking to you both.
Yeah, that's
Thank
great.
you.
Hello, that was great.
Hi.
Excellent.